Hello, Tigers and friends of Trinity University. Welcome to the first Call to Action, three-part webinar series. Tonight we will discuss African Americans and police violence. Extensive coverage in social media and by news outlets has brought this issue to national attention and indeed international attention. We will discuss local, state, and national perspectives and hear our panelists' perspectives on how and if San Antonio's response is changing. This event is part of lifelong learning initiatives presented by the Trinity University Alumni Relations and Development and the Office of Special Events. My name is Anene Ejikeme. I'm an associate professor in the Department of History. I've been at Trinity University since 2004, and I specialize in modern African history with a particular interest in issues of identity. It's my great pleasure to be here to moderate this discussion, and I thank Trinity University Alumni Relations and Development for the invitation. Without further ado, let us begin tonight's lecture. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. I will introduce them in order of appearance. Our first panelist tonight is Scott Williams, Trinity University class of 1989. Scott is managing partner and co-founder of Panorama Consulting. Scott's career has included coaching, both college football and baseball. Scott is a former officer of the US Secret Service Uniform Division, Foreign Missions Branch. Our second panelist is Professor Geary Reamy. Geary is a graduate of Trinity University, class of 1970. Geary earned his J.D. and LL.M. degrees from the Southern Methodist University Dedham School of Law. With a focus on criminal law, criminal procedure, and law enforcement issues, Geary practiced in the Dallas-Fort Worth area and served as legal advisor to the Irving Police Department. And our final panelist is Erik Walsh, San Antonio City Manager, Trinity University class of 1991. Prior to Erik's appointment as city manager, he served as deputy city manager from 2011 to 2019, overseeing the police and fire departments, the Metropolitan Health District, Office of Emergency Management, and the 311 Customer Service Center. If you're watching this webinar live, as I see that many of you are, please note that you may submit questions to the panelists using the Q&A tab. Following the presentations, I'll read your questions for our panelists to answer. I would like to start our discussion tonight with Scott Williams. Scott, please provide your perspectives on the role of race and racial tensions in the United States. I would like you to speak specifically about whether you think African Americans are still struggling with systemic disparity and whether they are victims of unfair treatment by police. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this evening's panel discussion. I have lived as a Black man in America for 53 years and also served as a police officer for a number of years. I have life experiences which I believe give me a unique perspective into this issue that I would like to share with you this evening. The United States was founded on a remarkable set of governing principles that unfortunately have never fully represented or protected African Americans. Even though we have participated in building this nation and also participated in protecting and defending this nation. Although we have been here for over 400 years, we have never been afforded the same benefits as white people. Basic human rights, such as equal access to education, housing, healthcare, or the ability to accumulate wealth from generation to generation. These circumstances have been compounded over generations and have contributed to broken down social conditions in many predominantly Black neighborhoods across this country, and have also led to these same neighborhoods being overly and aggressively policed. This in turn has led to the current issue of a disproportionate level of police violence against African Americans, especially Black males. There are other issues, such as negative stereotypes that exist in our culture, depicting Black people as dangerous. And many people, including police officers, believe these stereotypes. There is also a culture that is perpetuated in police academies of an us versus them type of mentality, a militarized or going into battle mentality that leads to this aggressive policing. Too many African Americans are stopped by police on a regular basis for simply being Black. Traffic stops, stop and frisk encounters with police, stopped for all types of questioning, which oftentimes leads to awful incidents. We only hear about the ones that went bad. We don't hear about the thousands of stops that happen daily that do not result in violence, but do, in fact, leave emotional wounds and scars that last a lifetime. To this point, let me provide some perspective, personal perspective, that is. My father was a New York City police officer and also served in the United States Army in the Korean War. I myself served in the United States Secret Service Uniform Division as a federal police officer. Our combined lifespan on this earth is 91 years. In those 91 years, we have each experienced numerous humiliating and demeaning encounters with law enforcement. Now multiply those unreported police encounters that we both experienced by all of the law-abiding Black men and women in this country. Just think about that for a moment. Do the math. That's a very concerning number of negative encounters with law enforcement for African Americans in total. It's too much. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, could not have happened to everyone. Certainly not every Black man and woman who is law-abiding has been stopped by the police unwarranted. So, okay, let's reduce that down to 10% of all the law-abiding African Americans that have been stopped unnecessarily. It's still way too much. These negative experiences over one's lifetime erode your self-worth, confidence, and esteem, and they devalue your place in society. Over time, they are corrosive and build anger, resentment, and mistrust in law enforcement. These experiences compound over one's life, often leading to chronic and life-threatening health issues, or manifest in extreme negative social behavior. As a former police officer, I've been in many dangerous situations where I had to make split-second decisions that could have escalated, or de-escalated a situation. Decisions that could have taken someone's freedom away if I made an arrest. Could have ruined a young kid's life if I put the cuffs on him and entered him into the system. Or worse, could have led to a person being hurt or possibly killed. However, many times I made the choice to de-escalate the situation, to talk someone down from a heightened sense of fear or intensity. Instead of arresting a young person, many times I brought them home to their parents. Far too often, police officers do not treat white and Black people the same. And as a result, African American youth get entered into the system for some of the very same petty infractions that white kids commit, but who are dealt with in a much more just and lenient way. Having served as a police officer, I understand how difficult the job is. I know the level of training and experience needed to do the job well. In my estimation, we need better hiring practices that identify and disqualify candidates who have racist views and/or who identify with or belong to fringe racist groups. When I was a senior at Trinity and I was in the midst of the hiring process for the Secret Service, I had to take a polygraph at the Federal Building in downtown San Antonio as part of an extensive background investigation. an investigation that went all the way back to my preschool days, where they interviewed my preschool teacher. Every police officer, in my opinion, should have to go through such a rigorous process. The job is too important to our society to stand for anything less. We also need better training. We need to demilitarize our police forces, and we need more thoughtful law enforcement policies and accountability measures. Before I close my opening remarks, I would like to share just one of many negative encounters I've had with law enforcement during my lifetime. While my first was at the age of 9, I will fast forward to my sophomore year in high school. I was walking from our school to the deli with my friends, Erik and Scott. All three of us, Black teenagers. One of these friends is now CEO of one of our major media networks here in the United States. We went to the Waldorf School of Garden City, a private school in an all-white, tree-lined suburban neighborhood on Long Island in New York. We were all wearing our Waldorf basketball jackets and dressed very nicely. Midway to the deli, which was about a mile from the school, 3 police cars converged on us. They executed what is known as a felony stop over the loudspeaker, commanding us to lay on the ground as if we were criminals. Forgive me if I get emotional during this, but these are real incidents. Scars are still there. Then they approached us and stood us up, and had us lean against the car with our hands spread out on the cold hood of the car and our feet spread apart. Imagine if this was your 17-year-old or 16-year-old. When asked why they stopped us, they did not tell us. About 20 minutes later, a mother of one of our white friends from the school drove by and inquired what was wrong. The officers told her we were suspects of a burglary. Imagine the humiliation we all felt in that moment. She vouched for us, but they continued to keep us there. Now, 30 to 40 minutes have passed. Mind you, it's 30 degrees out in the dead of winter, and we're still being detained. Then one officer approaches us and asks us why we were in Garden City and not in the village of Hempstead, which is the next town over that is a primarily Black neighborhood. We told them we went to the Waldorf school, even though that should have been pretty evident considering the jackets we were wearing. He then said we could go. Before we gathered ourselves and continued on to the deli, another officer says, "Next time you hear a house alarm, you should cross the street." To this day, I'm still trying to figure out what that meant. All of our parents demanded a public apology from the village of Garden City, as did the principal of our school, and we got it. But that apology didn't take away the embarrassment. It didn't take away the pain, nor did it take away the humiliation. This incident, among many others in my life, have remained with me ever since, and to this day, colors my perception of police. Even when I was in the Secret Service, I never felt comfortable around police when I was not in uniform. I often think about that incident and wonder what would have happened if we were 3 Black kids from Hempstead that day and not kids with parents who were well-established professionals with a little bit of influence. You see, my friend Scott's grandfather was a New York State judge, and Derek's mother was the head buyer for Lane Bryant department store, and my father a New York City police officer. What about all those kids that are stopped, who don't have anyone to advocate for them, who wind up in the system? These unnecessary and aggressive police encounters with African Americans must stop. There has to be a better way forward. This is not a political issue. It is an issue of humanity. Now, let me be clear. I fervently believe that all communities deserve strong, effective, fair policing. I am not in favor of defunding our police. I am, however, supportive of measured, thoughtful, and strategic police reform. I am advocating for a law enforcement community that is more compassionate, empathetic, fair, and just. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott, for that powerful testimony. I would like to turn now to our next panelist, Professor Geary Reamy. Geary, based on your extensive experience and research working with the Irving Police Department, please share your thoughts and perspectives on the question of police reform. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anene, and thanks to everyone who has joined this discussion this evening. We look forward to your questions and your comments, and I think that you, like I, will benefit very much from the remarks of my fellow panelists. I particularly thank Scott for sharing his own personal anecdote with us. It's much more powerful, I think, for us to understand this problem through the eyes of people who have been subjected to abusive policing. I don't mean to suggest by that all of the policing that goes on is abusive. Certainly in my lifetime, which is longer than Scott's, as you can probably tell by looking at us, I have never experienced the kind of degrading, humiliating treatment, the abusive treatment that Scott has just described. And I think that that frames the question for us this evening and the problem for us as a society. It is telling, I think, that I could go through my life having nothing but cordial encounters with the police officers who were willing and sometimes eager to be helpful to me, and Scott and so many Black citizens in this country experience just the opposite. So I wanted to help us this evening to introduce this topic, perhaps, by sharing not a personal anecdote, but by taking a few minutes to take a look at whether this is, in fact, a problem that we face nationally and here in San Antonio. And then my colleague, Erik Walsh, can address matters that are being taken here in our own city to address this problem. So let's begin this evening by taking a look at a slide that I have borrowed from data collected by the Washington Post. This is an ongoing study of the Washington Post that was begun in 2016. They have accumulated data from around the country related to killings at the hands of police officers. What I want us to focus on in this particular slide is that orange column on the left of your screen. You'll notice that it represents the number of Black people who have been killed. Now, it wouldn't do us much good to only know the number of people who have been killed at the hands of the police, because we would have to consider also, of course, the portion of the general population that our Black citizens represent. And so this graphic shows us, I think in stark terms, that the highest rate of killing by the hands of the police is of Blacks in our country. So if you are Black in the United States, you'll see that the killing rate there, if you will, is 33 per million. Whereas for those of us who are white, it's 13 per million. Hispanics fall in between. Now, these are national figures. So are we somehow better off in San Antonio or in Texas? Well, I've taken a look at a study that has been done by the Texas Justice Institute. We can take a look at this slide, which shows us officer-involved shootings in Texas. This tells us a little bit, but not much. The graph on the left side shows us that you're much more likely to be shot or in an incident involving shooting with the police if you are a male. But if we're interested in talking about race, as we are this evening, then if you take a look at the representation on the right side of your screen, you will notice that Blacks account for 27.8% of the police-involved shootings in the state of Texas. Now, again, that doesn't tell you very much unless you know how that compares with the general population. And so the Texas Justice Initiative has broken it out by the 5 major counties in the state of Texas. And here you have them demonstrated for you in this graphic. If you take a look at Bexar County, the one that is where I live and where Erik works, you'll notice that we come in very much like the other major counties in terms of police-involved shootings. Now, if you look at this column that's to the left, you see there are 2 columns that are representing Bexar County incidents. The one on the left side is the general population. Black citizens are represented by this blue area at 7.3% of the county. If you look at the column immediately to the right, you notice that although Blacks comprise 7.3% of the county population, 13.9% of the police-involved shootings involve Blacks. And so what that tells us, and you'll notice that this holds true across this entire graphic, whether it's Harris County or Dallas County, Tarrant County or Travis County, all of the counties, we find the same story playing out. Blacks are more likely to be involved in police shootings than their population would suggest in the counties in which they live. So let's talk about reform for a minute. If this is a problem, by the way, before I start to talk a little bit about reform measures, you might have taken a look at those graphics and thought, well, could it be that Black people are simply more dangerous? Maybe they're armed more often. Scott alluded to this perception in his comments. You will recall the rather notorious stop and frisk policy of the New York Police Department that gained such notoriety in past years. The litigation that took place regarding that policy produced an awful lot of data that we needed to have, should have had before that became such a public issue. In that data, it was determined that of the people who were stopped by the police and frisked in New York City, whites were twice as likely as Blacks to be armed. Okay, let me say that again. White people were twice as likely as Blacks to be armed. So we can't find an easy answer to this disproportionately high number of police-involved shootings in which a Black person is involved simply by saying, well, perhaps Black people present more of a threat to the police. So far, at least, the data we have collected does not bear that out. So if we're going to think about reform, what are the kinds of issues that are being talked about? Sometimes we hear about reform as if it's really just a single-sided issue. That is, somebody is, of course, outraged, as I think the country was outraged by the incident involving George Floyd. And so the response is we should outlaw chokeholds or any other kind of restriction of breathing. Okay, but that's an issue within the broader subject of reform. It is not the answer to police violence. And so let's think about some of what those issues are. First of all, we have to think about the law. As a lawyer and a law professor, this is what I do all the time. And so, of course, my first instinct is to turn to the law. How can we change the use of force laws, or how could we modify the policies? That's more in Erik's wheelhouse, the policies that are adopted by our local police departments that govern the officer's use of force. We want to think about those issues. Law, unfortunately, does not cure everything. I wish it did. If it did, it would be an awful lot easier to attract people to our law schools. But law is simply a tool, not the tool. Training. Scott, again, talked about this in his opening comments. We do need to improve training. We need to know what kind of training we should have. We need to be aware of the limitations on training. Again, as a teacher, I like to think about training. I like to think we can cure a lot of things by proper teaching, but I know that we can't. So we have to be realistic about training. Hiring practices, that polygraph that Scott talked about. When I worked at the police department, I also had to take a polygraph and subject myself to a background check, as I did in the U.S. Army. I think those are good things, but I can't tell you that they're foolproof. And I know Scott wouldn't suggest that they're foolproof either, but we need to do them, and we need to do them rigorously and do the best we can at screening out people who shouldn't be wearing a badge. Accountability. When someone does slip through that hiring net and then acts inappropriately or abusively, we need to hold that officer accountable. I'm a lawyer. I like lawyers, but I'm aware that there are lawyers who do bad things. They malpractice, and sometimes they hurt people because we have a certain degree of power in our society. When that happens, I'm the first person to demand that that errant lawyer be held accountable. And as a person who worked with the police and was myself a sworn officer in that department, I would say the same thing about policing. Do I back the blue? Absolutely. But I don't back any officer who acts in violation of the law or policy or in an abusive way. And so accountability is important. It's a difficult issue. We can talk some more about that, and I'm sure we will, but it is something we certainly need to address. Funding. Do we defund the police? And what does that even mean? Does it mean we take away all the funds for the police, zero out the police budget? There are some places where that's actually been discussed, but it's really difficult to do that. The city of Newark, New Jersey, basically wiped out their police department and started afresh, built a new police department. Of course, they built it around much of what was left from the department they had, but it signaled a radical change in their department. Is that what we mean? Is that what we need? Maybe we don't need that. In most places, we probably don't need that. But we have to think about funding. What we really talk about sometimes when we say defund the police is, are we using the police to do the right things? So do we really need, for example, a very expensively trained and expensively equipped police officer to work every call? When I have a little fender bender down at my nearest intersection, do I need to have a police officer in a fully equipped police vehicle show up, an officer who's very well armed, including with a semi-automatic assault weapon in the trunk of the vehicle, show up out there to write a report? Well, maybe not. Maybe we need to rethink that. That's what we're accustomed to. With police, we think of police as being the number you call when you don't know what to do. That's a real compliment to our police that they tackle all of these jobs. And it's one of the things that makes policing so hard. But is that really a good use of our resources and a good use of those officers? They wind up doing things they're not trained to do. They're not willing to do in many respects, certainly not eager to do. Is that the way we want to use the police? We just need to rethink that. The data that I have shown you has come from private sources, a nonprofit organization, the Texas Justice Initiative, and on the other hand, the Washington Post. Why didn't that data come from a central government repository for data that is reliable and thorough? And the answer is because there isn't such a place. And we really need, very importantly, we need to talk about the culture of law enforcement. Again, Scott talked about this, and I thought very effectively. And it's my experience as well. Culture is so terribly important. Ideas get handed down from one generation of police officers to the next. We want to make sure that that culture is pointing those new officers in the right direction. We have a reform effort that's underway right now in the state of Texas. House Bill 88, which has been dubbed the George Floyd Act, has been introduced by representative from Houston, and it has a lot of interesting features. It's an omnibus bill. Early days yet, the legislature's not quite in session, but it will be soon. I'm sure that many of these will fall by the wayside, or they will be amended, changed, sometimes radically perhaps. Maybe this bill won't get out of committee. But I suspect that something important will happen in the legislature. There will certainly be a lot of pressure to do so. So some of the things that are being talked about is to create a new tort action in Texas state law for the violation of civil rights by police officers, and the elimination of the concept of qualified immunity, which provides a real defensive shield, almost impenetrable defensive shield for officers who get sued. We don't want our officers to be afraid to do their jobs. At the same time, we want them to be held accountable. Liability may be one way to do that. The problem with that concept of accountability through litigation at the moment is not only do the officers get protected by qualified immunity, but even if they should be held liable, they are in almost all cases indemnified against loss by the county or city that employs them. So they don't pay anything out of their own pockets. This bill would change that if the officer is actually convicted of having committed some criminal act against a person. This bill would require minimum force, and it would also include a requirement to de-escalate. That's a term that Scott used. It's an important term for you to remember in this conversation. Another term that's also important is the duty to intervene. When one officer sees another officer overstepping the proper bounds, the officer who sees this behavior needs to step in. There is a requirement here in this bill for what's called a progressive disciplinary matrix. And what that means is that departments would be required to actually commit certain benchmarks for disciplinary action. Those would increase as the abuse increases. There are other features of this bill, limiting arrests for Class C or fine-only misdemeanors to reduce the number so that very few of those misdemeanors would be subject to arrest. You may not know, for example, that in the state of Texas, if you fail to signal a lane change, you can be handcuffed and taken to jail for that. That's an arrestable offense. This bill would do away with that. It would make it subject to a citation only. We would have, under this bill, a corroboration requirement for information or evidence given by drug informants. That's shown to be a source of very unreliable information and has resulted in some wrongful convictions. And there would be the prohibition on chokeholds, which pays homage to George Floyd's case. So just something for us to think about. These are all ideas. People are working and talking around the country, as you are this evening, about this important problem. And we all can contribute our ideas, but we need to be aware that this is not a simple problem to solve. And so it's going to require a multifaceted and effective resolution that will come from all of us. So with that, I look forward to your questions. I'm sure you have a bunch of good ones for us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gary. Okay, now I'd like to turn our attention to Erik Walsh. Erik, as you know, is the city manager of San Antonio, so we speak specifically about our own city. And Erik, I'd please like you to discuss some of the policies that San Antonio PD is undertaking. Thank you.
Thank you to Trinity for asking me to participate. I'm excited to be able to share at least some of my perspective and some of the issues that I'm dealing with as city manager of the 7th largest city in the country. And for just a little bit of context, we've got our police department is about almost 2,500 police officers out of a total 13,500 employees that work for the city. We spend the majority of our money in the police department, and it's where I probably have the most amount of liability for many of the things that Geary talked about. San Antonio is a city of 1.5 million people, and we get 2.2 million calls for service a year. A lot of the conversation that really occurred over the summer as we were going through our annual budget process after the killing of George Floyd was similar that other cities encountered all across the country, and I think it was really focused on some of the issues, on most of the issues that Scott shared with us. I think it's the realization of what is the role of police, and how and what should it look like going forward in the future. It is a necessary service and something that taxpayers expect, all of us expect, if we are caught in a moment where we need help. But what does it mean when we have 2.2 million calls for service? And one of the things that I laid out for our city council as we went through our proposed budget process this summer was more of a strategic look on a number of different areas, 4 main areas. The first was reviewing our engagements and encounters. I mentioned a second ago, we get 2.2 million calls for service a year. Those are, I spent some time during the summer with the police department and our management staff looking at the types of calls we receive. We do not receive 2.2 million calls for service for robberies or assaults or those things that we all think of when we think of calling the police. We get calls like my 17-year-old won't get out of bed, I need the police. Or there's a suspicious person walking down my street, I need the police. And I use that example because I saw a video during the summer that was shared by a community member to me of an encounter that a police officer had with several teenagers. And it happened in a neighborhood, a regular neighborhood in San Antonio at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon because the time was on the timestamp. And a woman had called the police because a group of teenagers had parked in front of her house on the street on public property and had begun walking around the neighborhood. And they were suspicious. So the video showed 2 officers arriving in one vehicle, a veteran officer, obviously a veteran officer, and would look like a probationary officer who was going on his required ride-along training with veteran officers that they've got to do for 6 months. And the encounter that unfolded before me as I watched the video started off normal, I guess, enough as it was. The officer explaining that a woman had called, well, what's going on? What are you guys up to? Nice enough, friendly enough. And the teenagers were young Black and Hispanic teenagers that looked no more to be 15, 16, 17 years old. And they explained that they have a cousin that lives down the street and they're just hanging out. And as I watched, I was waiting to see what was going to happen. I was trying to figure out why the video was sent to me. And after about 2 or 3 minutes, one of the teenagers said to the officer, the veteran officer, why are you harassing us? Why are you stopping us? What's up with all the questions? And the temperature of and the tone went from 2 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour in a split second. And the officer's tone got aggressive. The officer's tone took on a very defensive posture of questioning the police and not, you're making this a race issue. The teenager didn't say anything about race. And to me, the takeaway was that we have, those 4 or 5 teenagers had an encounter with police that was unnecessary. And what's worse about it is that we made it worse. The police department made it worse. And what's doubly worse about it is that we had a probationary officer standing there watching a veteran officer in this encounter. That officer is supposed to be teaching the probationary officer how to deal with situations. And that's not the behavior that we expect. So to me, that really encapsulated that we needed to look at how are we engaging the community in these calls for service that are not emergencies, and what kind of encounters are we leading? And so we're going through a pretty detailed process right now to kind of bisect that and figure out what really should we be doing in the future. So that's area number 1. The second area that we're doing is, and there's I'm sure anybody that's paid attention to this issue across the country, you've heard about alternative response to things like homelessness or mental health. And we're not doing that, but I've termed it a little bit differently. They are additive responses. And primarily in the areas of homelessness and mental health and maybe domestic violence. All of those situations, or two of those situations, generally involve family members calling the police about another family member. And too often those situations can turn deadly for both the residents or the police officers. Geary mentioned it. Police officers over time have become similar to school teachers. They've taken on all types of different roles. Everybody knows the 3 numbers 911, and maybe there's a different service that should be provided. If we're getting the same call at the same address for mental health episodes over a 2-week period or a 3-week period, where's the flag in the system to say, you know, these folks may need something different than the police. And as a community, as a public sector agency, my role of making sure that I'm working with the hospital district or the mental health authority or the county or the police department, regardless of boundaries, what should we be putting in place there? Because it's not the police. The third area that we're looking at is policies, and Geary mentioned a number of them. And while I think they are extremely important to setting the right tone and guidance for officers and making sure they're transparent for the community to understand and have input in, I'm confident that the San Antonio Police Department, I think unlike many of the other major Texas cities, has been really progressive in having outside independent reviews of our use of force policies. We have no chokeholds. We have no knock warrant bans. We have duty to intervene. We have de-escalation training. Every police officer, all 2,500 police officers are issued body cams. And if they work an off-duty job in our uniform, they're required to wear our body cam for many of the reasons that Geary mentioned. Because if they find themselves in a situation where they have to intervene as a peace officer, that body cam is important in being able to distinguish what exactly happened. The fourth area that we're looking at, and it's probably the one that has the biggest lift, is what I'll call our foundation or cornerstone issues. And there's some of the things that both Scott and Geary mentioned. They're the areas of accountability, discipline, training, promotions, how we promote, and our hiring practices. And in some cases, some of those areas are under the control, at least here in San Antonio, are under my control or under the police chief's control. Many of the areas under accountability and discipline are tied to our collective bargaining agreement. And you know, collective bargaining agreements here in San Antonio, meet and confer agreements in other cities, state law, maybe in other parts of the country. Over time, over the last 20 or 30 years, police unions have kind of created a braided protectionism of that accountability system, and it's been perfected. I have, as city manager, I'm accountable to the mayor and 10 elected officials, and I don't have a say in the discipline of 2,500 of my 13,000 employees. The police chief does not have final say in the discipline. And so as we enter negotiations with our local police union in January, because their contract expires next year, we've already made it very clear. The mayor and I went and talked to them last summer that one of our priorities, our single priority, is to rebalance that system. Those cornerstone issues of accountability and discipline, those things have to change in order to do the things that we all expect as taxpayers. Policies are important. Training is important. But if we don't have a rebalanced disciplinary system that puts the appropriate pieces in place, then it will be skewed. There was an article in today's paper today here locally about a Rice University report on civilian review boards for major Texas cities. And what it found was our review board here in San Antonio, which is authorized and has to be negotiated through the collective bargaining agreement, doesn't have a lot of the attributes that other cities do. Somewhere along the line in San Antonio's history, we made the mistake of negotiating those things into a collective bargaining agreement, and other cities haven't done that. And once it gets in that collective bargaining agreement, you have to shoehorn that thing out or pay for it in terms of benefits and pay. And so it is critical. I think there are 3 or 4 different types of civilian review boards for police discipline. None of them will be effective without a rebalanced arbitration and disciplinary process that puts that accountability back in the hands of either the police chief or the city manager or both, because it is designed to be skewed. So, to me, that is one of the takeaways. If anybody is listening and wants to be involved, pay attention to how that is effective, or how that's affected in your community, because it's done a number of different ways. And be involved and be vocal, because until we fix those cornerstone issues, I think we'll end up talking about things that at the end won't make some of the structural changes that both Scott and Geary talked about. As city manager, and I'm a little unusual because I grew up in San Antonio, so in my profession, it's a little unusual to be city manager in your hometown. You know, I want police officers that are that show empathy, provide good customer service, treat people with respect, and do the things that we all expect, and are there when we need them, and when the community needs them. So thank you for having me. I look forward to the questions. I hope I didn't run over on my time.
Thank you so much, Erik. Thank you, all our panelists. I mean, this has been really an interesting conversation. Before I get to the questions, we have several questions. I wanted to ask you, do you have any other thoughts you want to share before we get to the questions? We've got several excellent questions. Okay. I'll move straight to the questions, and I'll try and sometimes combine different questions. Before I start, I wanted to say that Geary said that, you know, he backs the blue, and I like that statement, because I think often we think back the blue and Black Lives Matter, two different things, or they're incompatible. But, you know, as Scott said, he was a police officer. His father was a police officer. Many Black Americans are police officers. So obviously they're going to back the blue. So it's not a question of either or. You know, you can back both. It's about the problem that we're trying to address today at this panel. So I'm glad that both, in fact, all three of you addressed this issue. Okay, there are a couple of questions that were already being answered as the questions were coming in. So there was a question about the police union, and I think that Erik has really answered that question. What is the role of the police union in all this? And I think we've all seen around the country, the police unions are very powerful, and San Antonio is trying to address that. There was also a question, actually two questions for Geary about the statistics. So I'll read the questions, and then I think Geary really answered them, but I think there's a question, do statistics take into account the rate of felony interactions with police by race? And then, you know, Geary did answer that. And then there was another question about saying that Mr. Remy stated that the percentage of African Americans killed by the police in relation to their racial percentage in society, but did not mention the percentage of violent felonies committed by race. Does that correlate? And I'll ask Geary to speak to that. But before I do, I wanted to say, I'm neither a lawyer nor police officer, but you know, I read the news like many of you, and some of you will have seen some of the egregious sentencing guidelines. There was a man who was sentenced to, I think, 30 years in prison for a felony. What was the felony? He attempted to steal, I think, you know, some gardening equipment, right? And because it was a break-in, that was considered a felony. So I think that you know, this question comes up again and again. But as Scott said, that the ways in which Blacks are stopped do not correspond to the ways in which whites are stopped. I mean, I went to college in the United States, and I knew friends who were stopped for drugs. But the white friends, who in fact, one of my white friends was the drug dealer on campus, was never stopped by the police. And when they were stopped, there were no repercussions. So I want Scott to speak to this question about the percentages and the correlation between Blacks and violence and the stops. Is there a correlation that we're, you know, ignoring here?
So I am not a trained professional like Geary is in terms of the
Right.
study of the numbers and the statistics related, but I will just say this. There are obviously a lot of crime that happens in Black neighborhoods. And there are many reasons why. There's gang activity that happens throughout various Black neighborhoods. there is, we know the situation that's happening in Chicago and other major cities. But I also will pose the question, throughout the history of our country, there have been Irish gangs that were very violent and dangerous. There have been Italian gangs that were very violent and dangerous and terrorized communities. There have been Jewish gangs that were very violent and dangerous, as well as Latino and Black gangs. So my question is, why aren't Jewish and Italian and Irish people stopped arbitrarily the way Black and Latino are stopped on the streets? That's the issue that we've been talking about. There is an issue of crime in predominantly Black neighborhoods. And I would say that majority of Black people in those neighborhoods do not want the police to go away, but they do want better policing. But when I hear someone bring up the question about Black crime, when we're talking about police violence, I want you to focus on the issue we're speaking of. And I also acknowledge that there is a criminal activity that we need to pay attention to and we need to resolve in the communities of color. There's no one that would deny that. We're going to put a lot of effort there too, but we need police officers also to understand the neighborhoods they're patrolling and police. I'll turn it over to Gary if you want to answer the other part of that question.
I do want to add a little something to that. I don't know if it really add much to it because I very much appreciate your comment on that, Scott. I think it gets right to the very heart of the issue and something we need to be aware of. Absolutely, of course, there's crime. There's sometimes serious crime that's being committed in Black neighborhoods, but there's being the same kind of serious crime that's being committed in all of our neighborhoods. We need to remember that criminal activity very often is linked much more to socioeconomic factors than it is to race. So if we're really looking for where you're likely to find more crime, well, where do people have no real alternative other than the opportunity that's afforded, for example, by drug dealing? Another thing, and this touches on the anecdote that Erik shared with us, which I think is just so important to understand. If a rookie officer is riding around with a field training officer and they're patrolling a beat that is predominantly Black, and the field training officer says to the rookie, this is a really high crime area. We got a lot of drug activity here. We got a lot of gang activity here. So you need to watch out because you're going to see that everywhere. And don't take anything that these people tell you as the truth because they will lie to you as soon as they will look at you. What does that do to that rookie officer? The officer absorbs that as not only part of the culture of policing in that city or in that county, but as the gospel truth. Oh, well, the officer's telling me this. This is my colleague. This officer has learned this through hard experience and probably through following hard data as well. And so I should take that on board. And now every time that officer, either of those officers, sees somebody or interacts with somebody in that neighborhood, they're thinking, oh, I wonder if I'm talking with somebody who's dealing drugs. Probably so. This guy's probably up to no good. See someone walking down the street, I'll bet that they're about to engage in criminal activity if they haven't just already done so. And I assure you that when an officer in my neighborhood sees me walking down the street, which often happens, I don't think they have the same idea at all. That's an example of implicit bias and an example, as Erik's story demonstrated so well, of how we develop implicit bias. So I think we have to keep all of that in mind when we look at statistics. I think statistics are absolutely vital, but I don't think they tell the whole story.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to go to the next question. And this one is for you, Erik. There's a question about the Bexar County prosecutor. Would you describe a prosecutor as progressive, as someone who's reform-minded or more traditional?
I'd probably characterize him all the above. I think he's tried to be a little bit more progressive. One of the first things he did when he was elected was work with the San Antonio Police Department and the city to implement a cite and release program that we had developed but not implemented because the prior district attorney had some hesitancy. And so, and from that perspective, we were able to implement that immediately upon his election, and we provide quarterly updates, and those updates are on our website. But what it does is it does some of the things that Scott described, which gives officers a little bit of latitude to potentially cite individuals rather than arrest them for low-level crimes that the chief has the authority to under state law. So we work very closely with him.
Thank you. Okay, there's also a question that I think will be it's addressed to both Scott and Gary. Someone noted that, Scott, you mentioned that you don't believe in defunding the police, but you think that the police should be retrained, hired have a more rigorous hiring process so that, the sort of white nationalists are weeded out, because we know that white nationalists in the police force is a real problem, according to the FBI and Christopher Wray. So would you support having people who are trained in mental health either to work with the police, to go out for calls? I mean, if you're getting 3 million calls, 2 million calls a year, maybe they should go alone, through 311. And that's also a question that was, posed to Erik, because you are dealing with the police, and someone noted that we know that that she knows that the San Antonio Police Department has had mental health training. So can you both address that issue of mental health training, how to not send that armed, police who look like they're going to a war zone to answer a call, my teenager can't get out of bed, right?
Yeah, so I would say that I definitely think there should be social workers that are trained that either are implemented into the police department or work hand in hand with the police department, where there are certain calls where you need someone that is highly trained with dealing with someone that might have mental issues, or that can deal with something that is really not, shouldn't be in the purview of the police department. I think we have to just rethink what are the types of calls that our police officers are called to. I'll tell you from my experience in DC, when I worked as a police officer with the Secret Service in DC, and I was protecting and patrolling Northwest DC area and other parts of Maryland and Virginia. If there was a medical issue, oftentimes police were called, and we would go and we would have to be trained in first aid, and we were the initial ones on the scene, and then paramedic were called. Maybe police should not be responding to those incidents. Maybe paramedics should be called right away. Oftentimes there would be the case of someone that was inebriated, asleep on a sidewalk. We would be called because they happened to be sleeping in front of an embassy, and we had to deal with that situation when we should be actually focusing on protecting the embassies, protecting the neighborhood, going to more dangerous situations. And there could be social workers that are responding to those cases that have direct communication to the police department, so that if they need help, then we're called to come in and assist.
Thank you. Erik, do you want to add anything to that?
Oh, well, I just, I'll say that I think Scott hit the nail on the head there. There are other ways to be able to deal with that, and this country has become comfortable or has become attuned to calling 911 and calling the police. I think that I do think it is not correct to think that it's always going to be it's got to be somebody else. I do think that many situations do require the police, and I'm not thinking about Scott's example. I'm thinking about mental health calls or domestic violence calls. 2 months ago, we had 2 police officers respond to a domestic violence call here in San Antonio, and at an apartment complex, and the officer saw the young woman on the balcony of the first floor, and he was talking to her, and she said, well, he's still inside. You know, the officer watched, he said, well, open the front door, and he started walking over there to the front door, and the guy came out and started shooting at the police officer. That is not the situation we want to send social workers to. But I think it's a balance, and I think it requires some really deep thought about how we provide services and respond to emergencies and support the community.
Okay, you know, we're slowly running out of time. We've been told we can go to 7:45, but there's some very important questions that have come that I think we should really get out there. So if you don't mind, I want to read 3 questions, and then, you know, you can each take 1 or 2, okay? So there are 2 questions that really say, the first one says, the root causes must be addressed, this writer says. Please bring that up. Crime is driven by hopelessness, poverty, and lax gun laws, okay? And there's a second question that has to do with this. Research indicates that the systemic inequities, of law enforcement do not account for the larger initiatives in the nation. For example, when individuals do not have jobs, they may turn to crime and to survive and to thrive. So these are dealing with, you know, again, something that you brought up, the issue of poverty and how, and crime. Okay, there's also, I want to read 2 more, and then I'm going to let you answer 1 each or 2 each. The writer says, thank you, Scott, for sharing your powerful speech. There was another person also who thanked Scott at the beginning. It says, to all speakers and participants, are you aware of the FBI's report about white supremacists who are working in law enforcement? I mean, I brought this up, but I think it may be worth addressing if Erik can tell us about what's going on in San Antonio. And are you aware of the Southern Poverty Law Center's work that tracks hate groups? And the writer says from the Brennan Center's summary of FBI reports, so there was an FBI report in 2006, and more recently, Ray has said that this is also an ongoing issue. The third question I wanted to pose is that the writer says, what do any or all of you think of the circular irony that in reality that the more stringent the background checks are likely going to hit Black people first and hardest, that the day-to-day behaviors that would be indicators that a white person is not fit to be a police officer are not criminalized and are not dog whistled in law and policy. Meanwhile, day-to-day behaviors of Black people are criminalized and dog whistled in law and policy. I think those are really important questions. So I wanted to read them for the audience also to see the important questions that are coming in. And if you could each take 1 or 2, and then if we have more time, we'll have 1 or 2 more questions to close the discussion. Thank you.
So I'll jump in and I'll take that question that was addressed to me with regard to the awareness of white supremacy in police departments and those studies that have been done on that by the Southern Poverty Law Group, as well as the FBI study. I am aware. I don't have any personal experience of knowing for sure that somebody was a part of a supremacist group or had any type of leanings towards white supremacist groups or thoughts and feelings. I will say this, from my personal experience working in law enforcement, there was a lot of stress and strain between Black police officers and white police officers. When I actually started on my job and you went into the roll call room, it was unbelievable to see how white officers were on one side of the room, Black officers on another. I happened to be a roommate with a white officer, so we were stuck in the middle, not knowing where to sit our first day on the job. That's how bad it was. And I remember driving with certain people and them jumping out of the car while 3 people were sitting on the stoop in a 90-degree day, and him starting to question people and me saying, what in the world are you doing? And his response, they shouldn't be hanging out like this. You know, you shouldn't be playing games on the street. They were playing craps. My response to him was, who cares about craps? And have you ever been in a hot walk-up brownstone in the middle of the summer with no AC in it? Where do you think you go? You sit on the stoop where there's air flowing. You know, they're just, so there are issues and there are attitudes that are pervasive that add to the stress and the conflict between officers, and that also play out in how things are enforced on the street. And I will say that, my father went through it as well. My father went through it 30 years before I did. And it continues today in police departments. And that's not to say that that every white police officer is bad or that they're all white supremacists. That's not what I'm saying. But there is an element that's there that needs to be rooted out. And I think it can be rooted out by having specific questions as part of the polygraph process. You're not going to catch it all, but you will catch some of it.
Gary, do you want to add anything to these questions?
Well, I think we've had a very good, robust discussion in the time that we have. It's obvious from the wonderful questions that have been posted, and I've been following these as our participants have added them. It's obvious that we have not only well-informed people who are participating this evening, but we have a lot of interest in this, which is certainly one of the defining issues of our time. I take great heart in that. I think it's important, as you can see from just the topics we've touched on tonight, and we literally have just touched on them. We could have spent many hours on any one of these topics and even subtopics. It's obvious that we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of ideas to test. We have a lot of important cultural changes to make. And remember, as people have pointed out, as a society, we have the policing that we want. We have the policing that we've asked for. We have the policing that we have tolerated. If we don't like what we have, it's up to us to make changes. We can't just say, well, the police should change internally. We all have to play a part in that. Whether it's policy, Erik has an important part to play, but it's not all up to him to control the San Antonio Police Department. It's up to the officers. It's up to the administrators in that department. It's up to outside people. It's to people like me who study from afar and throw little nuggets into the conversation. It's up to people like Scott who share lived experience with us. So I hope this will be a starting point, maybe a springboard for a lot of us to carry on the conversation and do more, take action about these important issues. So thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much, Gary. I think that's a wonderful note on which to end. And a number of our participants have pointed out that we all have a role to play in. Gary, you mentioned implicit bias earlier on. We are all victims of implicit bias. Whatever our color, we all have implicit bias. And so, police officers, of course, are also going to have implicit bias. And I think we all have to work to treat each other as humans, first of all, and not to jump to conclusions. We have 2 more minutes before 7:45, so I won't take any more questions, but I want to thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. This is part 1 of the 3-part series, Call to Action. The next 2 sessions will occur in the spring with topics focusing on access to healthcare and access to education. For additional learning, TUgether content, including other webinars, podcasts, and book club information, please visit the Lifelong Learning page on the Alumni website. This completes tonight's webinar. Thank you for joining. Go Tigers!